Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. You know, one of the hardest lessons I've had to learn as a professor and in my role at Logos Bible Software is that most Christians think Bible reading is Bible study. It isn't. That's followed by the corollary that what most people do beyond Bible reading isn't going to get them very far into the text either. That is, what most people think of as Bible study isn't real biblical research. Poor sources and the axiomatic result of poor interaction with the biblical text is often at the heart of why pastors, seminary students, and lay people I've encountered over the years get annoyed with me. I don't accept poor arguments and uninformed source material that produce positions and arguments that just aren't text-driven. Most well-meaning believers unfortunately believe they're digging into the Word when they read writers like Chuck Swindoll or Greg Laurie or Max Lucado or, well, fill in the blank with any popular Christian Bible teacher. In fairness, though, I remember reading Swindoll's character study on Joshua when I was a teenager and really liking it. But after one or two of those things, I realized I was just reading about the Bible. I wasn't really penetrating the text. In other words, I wasn't discovering anything that I couldn't learn through only a close reading of my English translation. Swindoll was a step in the right direction, but soon failed to satisfy. Other writers like Spurgeon or Andrew Murray or Lloyd Ogilvie were helpful to me, but I wanted to know the text, not just get some helpful insights for my spiritual life. And for the record, I've come to realize that a close knowledge of the text and being moved to live right before God are not mutually exclusive. My next step in high school was taking commentaries to study hall. That's something I recall telling my wife about only after we were married. Granted, I'm a text nerd, and I still think that there's something wrong with the Christian who doesn't want to know the text. I don't imagine I'll ever repent for that thought either. But I of course understand that every believer isn't going to learn Greek and Hebrew and all the other stuff that scholars study. That isn't God's calling for most people. However, every believer can always be doing something that encourages more attention to the text. That thing we say we believe is inspired. There are tools everyone can learn to use with competence so that they are less dependent on English translations and on the opinions of others. Dedication to the text, and only the text, won't answer every question we have. At times the text is ambiguous. But it will, if we allow it to, steer us to a more biblical theology. And then you can be in prayer about taking the lumps that come with that. Now, I've said all that to say this. This episode marks the beginning of a Naked Bible podcast series focused on helping you discover tools to use for getting into the original biblical text, even if you can't read Greek and Hebrew. And, more importantly, why you'd want to do that. Almost a year ago, I wrote a post on the Naked Bible entitled Heiser's Laws for Bible Study. I'd like to go through that list in the time we have remaining, since I'll be unpacking these thoughts in episodes to come, and adding to that list in an effort to help listeners become students of the Bible, not just readers. So here are Heiser's laws for Bible study. 1. There is no substitute for close attention to the biblical text. Now, after my intro, that sort of goes without saying, but think about it. How can you say you hold to a biblical theology without being able to root what you believe in the biblical text? Many Christians have a creedal theology, or a heard it from my parents theology, or a my pastor says that theology, or even that book in the Christian bookstore said it theology. Now, those won't necessarily be deeply flawed, though they could be, but they are second-hand and based on someone paraphrasing what they read in an English Bible, no less. Chances are they're adequate for basic ideas, but they more often than not fall very short of being a carefully thought biblical theology that derives from the text. Number 2, you should be observing the biblical text in the original languages. Now, if you can't do that, never trust one translation in a passage. Use several, and then learn some skills for understanding why they disagree. That's the important thing. These skills would be things like learning grammatical terms and concepts so you can follow the discussion in a serious commentary, that is, a commentary that engages the original text. Other skills might include learning something about translation philosophy. You know, every English Bible translation of recent origin has a rarely read preface where the translation committee explains their philosophy. It also might include learning about thinking fallacies that can trip up interpreters, including scholars. Clear thinking often involves knowing what can be said and what can't be said about a given word or a passage. You can accumulate a lot of data, but if you don't think clearly about that data, they won't yield the results that they ought to. Number 3, patterns in the text are more important than word studies. Christians who want to go beyond Bible reading often graduate to word studies. Now, word studies are important, but they're a starting point, not an end point for thinking about the text. And if you take a look at word study resources that are perennial bestsellers, like Strong's Concordance and Strong's Dictionary, they are little more than grocery lists of alternative English word options for your English translation. And grocery lists lend themselves to a smorgasbord approach to Bible study. For instance, I'll have that one, but I think I'll pass on that meaning over there. It may give my beliefs indigestion if I use it. There's really more to word studies than picking from a list of English possibilities. And word studies, again, are not as important as patterns in the text. That is, how terms keep popping up with close proximity to other terms and other phrases, perhaps in the same order, or in juxtaposition with another cluster of items. Word study tools will not only not get you to that sort of observation, they won't even suggest it. Number 4, the New Testament's use of the Old Testament is the key to understanding how prophecy works. Now, it's hard to overemphasize this one, since one inspired piece of literature ought to be our guide in regard to another. At least you'd think so. But if I had $1 for every time I've had a conversation that included someone telling me how XYZ Old Testament prophecy will be fulfilled or was fulfilled, without the speaker knowing that the New Testament author clearly does not quote the Old Testament as it appears, or that the New Testament author never said a particular Old Testament passage meant what this person says it means, I'd be driving a better car. Think of it this way. If you believe the New Testament writers were inspired when they quote the Old Testament, which was also inspired, might it not be a good idea to see how they quote it? Might it not also be a good idea to not say an Old Testament passage meant XYZ or was a sign of some event in Jesus' day or a future time, when a New Testament author never quoted it that way at all? My favorite example here is the Song of Solomon, which many Christians are taught has a meaning to symbolize the relationship of Christ and the church. It's too bad that idea never occurred to Paul or any other New Testament writer. The Song of Solomon is never quoted and applied to Christ and the church in that way in the New Testament. Even passages like Song of Solomon 2:1, the passage that talks about the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valley, are not quoted about Jesus in the New Testament. In fact, there isn't a single clear citation of the Song of Solomon anywhere in the New Testament. Sure, you might find a cross-reference to it in your English study Bible, but scholars who've actually looked at all the places in the New Testament where the writer cites the Old Testament will tell you just what I told you. So thinking the Song of Solomon is about Christ's love for the church may give you a warm, fuzzy feeling, but it isn't biblical theology. Number 5, the Bible must be interpreted in context, and that context isn't your own or that of your theological tradition. It's the context that produced it. In other words, the ancient Near East, the ancient Mediterranean. Put another way, If you're letting your theological tradition filter the Bible to you, you aren't doing Bible study. The Bible wasn't written during the period when Augustine or other church fathers lived, or the Middle Ages when Aquinas was writing, or the Reformation when Luther and Calvin were writing, or the fundamentalist era, or the era of modern evangelicalism. Those contexts are all foreign to the biblical context, and yet those contexts are constantly allowed to be the filter for the Bible to us. Again, you have a theology if that's what you're doing, but you can't call it a biblical theology. It might be consistent at points with a biblical theology, but it may also be ignorant of or run counter to biblical theology. Number 6, the Bible is a divine human book, treated as such. Now notice what I didn't say. I didn't say the Bible is a divine book. I said it's a divine human book. Both parts of that equation are crucial and necessary. And to be blunt, they were both chosen by God with respect to how this thing we call the Bible would be produced. Put another way, God chose people to write the biblical text, and people write using grammar, in styles understood by their peers, and with deliberate intent. And so the Bible didn't just drop from heaven. Study it as though some person actually wrote it, not like the result of a paranormal event. Number 7, if a passage is weird, it's important. In other words, what we see in the text is there for a reason. It's not random, and it must be treated in context, the context of where it's immediately found, the larger context of the book, think chapters and sections, and then the whole book, and then the still larger context of the biblical worldview, which, as we just noted, is not your worldview, nor was it any worldview after the 1st century A.D. Just because a modern person finds a passage odd or offensive or downright bizarre doesn't mean it was just stuck in there to fill space or creep people out who'd live at a future time. It has a role to play in biblical theology. Number 8, don't hire someone to stock the grocery shelves who can't read the labels. Or, don't put your meds in the daily pill tray unless you can read the instructions. Now what I mean by that is putting Bible verses in categories of meaning, which is what systematic theology does, really isn't helpful, and it can be misleading if what you think those verses mean doesn't derive from exegesis of the original text. Now you'd be rightly alarmed if you heard that the person working at the pharmacy who was putting the pills into bins and bottles and then shelves couldn't read well or at all. The same applies to theology. Biblical theology should be done from the ground up, beginning with careful analysis of the biblical text, the grunt work of exegesis and original language study. Then you put those results of that work into some order. It shouldn't be done from the top down, starting with English translation and then making categories of things to believe. That's just proof texting, but the dirty little secret in Christian education is that that's precisely what you're getting with a lot of theology books and Bible study books that are translation-based. Number 9, if, after you've done the grunt work of context-driven exegesis, what the biblical text says disturbs you, let it. Put another way, if you aren't bothered by the Bible, you really can't be reading it closely. If your head isn't filled with questions about what you've read, about how the idea you just got from a passage needs to be balanced with some other passage, then you really haven't studied the Bible. You may have read it to get a spiritual buzz, but you're not thinking the thoughts of the text like you could. And trust me, the buzzes are better the deeper into the text you go. Number 10, build a network of exegetical insights you can keep drawing upon. The connections are the result of a supernatural mind guiding the human writers. The only way to think God's thoughts are to follow the crumbs in the text where they lead, one at a time. This is one reason I encourage people to read the Bible like it's a fictional novel. You instinctively know when reading fiction that the writer is doing something to you, drawing your attention or deflecting it, leading you somewhere or misdirecting you for some clever reason. We read a novel and we just know we'll see that place again, or hear that piece of dialogue again, or we'll see that character again. We just know because our minds are wired in a certain way that's triggered when we go into our "I'm reading a novel" mode. We see the words differently when we're in that mode, as opposed to reading something like a textbook. Well, I hope these 10 laws stimulate your thinking. In the episodes that follow, I'll branch off these ideas to help you progress in your own pursuit of the biblical text and what it reveals. Until next. Now, in our last episode, I began a series on Bible study, and that was really broadly defined. And what I want to do in this episode is sort of narrow that a little bit, give you a little better view of where I'm going to be going in this series, at least for the next few episodes, the near future. I've entitled this one, Taking the Bible's Own Context Seriously, and that's worded deliberately. Own context is going to be important. It's going to be the focus of what I'm going to say in this episode. Now, anybody who's listening to me here who has been engaged in anything you'd really call Bible study, something beyond just mere Bible reading, has probably heard the piece of advice that goes something like this. You must interpret the Bible in context to properly understand it. Okay, to properly interpret it, to know what it's saying accurately. Now, that's, of course, true, but the problem with it is, what does it mean? The reality is that there are a lot of different contexts that we could talk about. If you're looking at a given verse, there's an immediate context of the immediately preceding verses and the verses that immediately follow, or maybe the immediately preceding and following paragraphs, or a few paragraphs. Of course, then there's the book context, the context of the whole book. And then there's the context of what else the writer of your book happened to write in terms of the Bible, if that can be determined. And then even bigger than that, there are sections of the Bible, wisdom literature, for example. If your passage falls in that larger section, then that gives it a context as well. If you're looking on the word level, the context of individual words would, of course, be how the word is used in that book, maybe in that chapter, by that author. Again, that would be a semantic context. There's a grammatical context. How are the words in your verse used in relationship to other words? Okay, there are grammatical relationships to think about because the original languages of the Bible were human languages. They have grammar, they have rules. And there are things you can say grammatically and things you can't say. So that's another different kind of context. So which context are we talking about? Usually nobody really thinks about it that much when they tell you that, or when they're trying to practice it. It takes a professor to muddy those waters like I've just done. But it's not actually being a busybody. These are real issues. These are real contexts. They're all different, and they all, in theory, work together. But what I'm actually going to talk about for the remainder of this episode and the next few episodes is the meta context, the much bigger picture. I want to sort of get you into the mindset that to really properly understand the Bible, you need to keep 3 things in mind. We'll start with these 3 thoughts. And that will help you understand what I'm talking about when I talk about taking the Bible's own context seriously. The first thought is that biblical writers were people too, just like you and me. Now you say, well, that's just painfully obvious. Of course they're people. They're not robots or something like that. They're people. Yeah, that is obvious, but how have you really thought about that? Have you ever really thought about it at all? And what are the implications? Well, let me just unwrap this a little bit so you know what I'm talking about. Understanding that the biblical writers were people, just like you and me, really directs our thoughts when it comes to this thing we call inspiration, and then the product of inspiration, the Bible itself. Evangelicals, I think, tend to view inspiration as a series of paranormal events. Prophet gets up in the morning, starts making breakfast, and then all of a sudden God just decides to zap them, or he has a vision or some message in his ear, and he sort of goes into a trance. And then at some point he goes into an automatic writing mode, and just his arm just starts moving, and words come out on the parchment. And then he wakes up, looks at the results, and says, wow, that's pretty neat. It's hard to believe that I could do that. I'm just so thankful God took over my mind and wrote that for me. Again, that is a myth. That is not the way inspiration works. And it's easy to demonstrate that in any number of ways when you actually look closely at the biblical text. There is evidence for things like editing. There are 3 synoptic gospels that when you have a dialogue between characters, even when Jesus is one of them, the dialogue changes. Folks, in real time, the real-time events of that dialogue, only one thing was said by a speaker. Speaker A and Speaker B only said one thing. They didn't just keep rehearsing the conversation so that later on the synoptic writers would have different words to use. Okay, that's just nonsense. Biblical writers were people too. What it means is that this process we call inspiration, and the product, this thing we call the Bible, was produced by people used by God, chosen and used by God. The Bible is not a series of paranormal events. I like to say the Bible is not a divine book. It's a divine human book, so treat it that way accordingly. God used people. God made a decision to choose a certain person on a certain occasion, living at a certain time in history, who grew up in a certain culture, had a certain worldview. He chooses that person for who they are, where they're at, and what's floating around in their mind is what they've been exposed to since the time of their birth. Okay, it's their worldview. And he takes that person and through a series of providential acts all through their life, prepares them for the day that he's going to prompt them through his Spirit to start writing something down. And he lets them do it because they're people. This is who God uses. He uses people. He doesn't take over their minds. He doesn't dictate their words. He lets them do their job because he picked them for the job. These are God's decisions, and they take place in real time with real people. Now, what that in turn means is that the thing those biblical writers produce has a context, and that becomes the biblical context because what they're writing is biblical material. So this leads to my second thought, that the context of the Bible that we should take seriously is not your context. It's not my context. It's not the context, here's a third thought, of great thinkers in the past. The biblical context is not the context of Augustine, or Tertullian, or Aquinas, or Martin Luther, or John Calvin, or John Wesley, or Billy Graham, or C.I. Scofield, or B.B. Warfield, or Charles Ryrie, or John Walvoord, or John MacArthur. Just fill in the blank. Biblical theology is not oriented to the views, the worldviews that any of those people had. The biblical context is not their context. All those contexts, the medieval context, the early church fathers context, the Reformation context, the context of modern evangelicalism, all those contexts are foreign to the Bible. They are alien contexts when it comes to the real context of the biblical writer. And that context is supposed to be the one we take seriously. It's supposed to be the one that should guide our thoughts as we seek to interpret the Bible. But more often than not, what happens is that we filter the Bible through a denominational tradition. We filter the Bible through a historic creed. The Reformation era produced a number of creeds. And it's not that creeds are bad or hopelessly flawed. Okay? The idea is
that creed and the context which produced it and the people that produced it are not the biblical context. The biblical context is foreign to all of that. And so if you're really going to take the Bible in context, in its own context, and you're going to be serious about it, you can't filter it through any of these other contexts. That's a difficult task because it means sort of mentally thinking the thoughts of a pre-modern person living between the 2nd millennium BC and the 1st century AD, because those are the contexts of the biblical writers. They are not these modern things or even ancient things like the era of the Church Fathers. That era was centuries removed from even the latest biblical context. Those are foreign contexts. So how do we do this? I mean, how do we train our minds to be able to think like a person living in the 2nd or 1st millennium BC? How do we capture their worldview for ourselves? Well, there is a way to do that, and granted, it's not perfect, it's not complete, it's not without peril. And by that I mean it's not without potential to misunderstand or get something wrong. But you actually can do that, and the way to do that is to permeate your mind, permeate yourself with the literature and the worldview thinking, the religion of the ancient Near Eastern cultures, ancient Near Eastern civilizations, the ancient Near Eastern, or ancient Mediterranean, being a little wider here, worldviews that were just automatically floating around in the heads of the people who produced the Bible. We can, to a large extent, tap in to their literature, and that's the way ideas are preserved. Ideas aren't preserved by pieces of pottery and things like that. They're preserved through what people write and through what people draw. There's just higher communicative value in those things that help us get into the mindset, get into the heads of the biblical writers. And so we need to expose ourselves to the literary output, the intellectual output of ancient Near Eastern cultures and civilizations from the 2nd millennium BC all the way to the 1st century AD. Now, that's what's known in scholarly parlance as comparative studies. And comparative studies, again, refers to how we understand the biblical material, the biblical literature, in comparison to and in comparison with, in concert with, the intellectual output of these other cultures that were contemporaneous to the biblical writers. This is the gateway, again, to exposing yourself to the Bible's own context. Now, historically, again, you would think this would be sort of a no-brainer, but it hasn't been. And particularly within the evangelical orbit, there has been a time that has only really changed in recent decades where comparative studies was viewed with suspicion. And there are some reasons for that. Now, in one of my MEMRA courses, actually in a couple, I use an essay by the Old Testament scholar John Walton, who teaches at Wheaton. And John is somebody I know, he's a friend. And I use his essay in the first volume of the Zondervan Illustrated Biblical Backgrounds Commentary. I want people to read that because it's an essay about the comparative method and comparative studies. And I'm going to read a little bit of that to you so that you get a little bit of an understanding why it's important, but also why within sort of an evangelical or conservative tradition, this just hasn't been done. People in those traditions have just had their Bible filtered to them through their own tradition of evangelicalism or the Reformation or something else. So Walton begins here, just a paragraph or two. He says, "For over a century, studies comparing the Old Testament and the ancient Near East have hovered on the fringe of hermeneutics and exegesis." What he means by that is they've just been sort of kept at arm's length, out on the periphery. Continuing, Since these studies were at times exploited by critical scholars for polemical attacks against the biblical text, evangelicals were long inclined to avoid or even vilify them. They viewed the idea that the Old Testament borrowed or adapted ancient Near Eastern ideas or literature as being incompatible with Scripture's inspiration. Even as evangelicals in recent decades have grown more interested in tapping into the gold mine of comparative data, the results have often been considered tangential to the ultimate theological task. The influence from the ancient world has been identified with all that Israel was supposed to reject, as they received revelation from God that would purge their worldview from its pagan characteristics. Comparative studies served only as a foil to the theological interpretation of the text. Now, let me stop there. What Walton is saying, to summarize here, is that since the comparative enterprise, the knowledge of the intellectual output of these other civilizations, were used by people hostile to the Bible to make the Bible appear as a forgery or some sort of plagiarized thing, or in another sense, just as pagan as the pagans. Since those arguments were attempted by scholars who were hostile to the biblical material, and they used this comparative material to do that, people who had a high view of Scripture tended to, again, keep this context at arm's length. They wanted to sort of imagine that Israelites, and of course later on when we talk about Judaism, that God's people were somehow intellectually and mentally and culturally utterly different than their neighbors. And when you look at comparative material, you find out real quickly that that just is not the case. This is actually getting into this is a New Testament idea, but this whole thing about the people of God being in the world but not of it. The biblical writers were not divorced from their culture. They did not shun their culture when it came to, well, here's how we write a treaty, or here's how we talk about what goes on in the unseen world. Here's what happens, in the afterlife. There is a tremendous amount of overlap because they were using the vocabulary, the forms of expression, the symbols that people around them were familiar with because they all had a shared ancient Near Eastern culture. They had to do that to communicate. If they would have been using words and ideas and symbology that was completely foreign to the people they were writing to, nobody would have understood it. So it's easy to see that the biblical writers very much were a product of their culture. They were in that world, but in another sense, they were not of it. Their theology was different. And the more you understand, the more you know ancient Near Eastern material, the more you're able to put yourself back in that worldview. Yeah, in many cases, you will see things, ideas, that are completely transferable between Israelite culture and ancient Near Eastern culture, and they will help you understand a passage that is just really odd or weird. But, on the other hand, the more you know that stuff, the more able you are to discern the differences. And the differences are really important because, more often than not, they are theological statements. They are declarations of the biblical writer, in effect saying, hey, you're all familiar with this set of ideas, but here's what's different about our God. Here's what's different about what we believe. And they will use the language and the imagery that people will understand, but they'll change things in a subtle way. Or they'll use a particular item, say maybe a text, a portion of the Baal cycle, for instance. They'll use that and they'll make it serve a different end that will be glorifying to Yahweh, the God of Israel, instead of Baal, the God of the Baal cycle. They'll do things like this, but you're only going to be able to know what they're doing and why when you can track with them. You can track mentally with them. Now, Walton continues here one more paragraph. He says, consequently, again, because of this recent interest, and again, the suspicion that went with it, consequently, comparative studies have been viewed as a component of historical critical analysis at best. That's what the scholars do. It doesn't really help us talk about biblical theology. More often, Walton says, it was viewed as a threat to the uniqueness of the literature of the Bible. In contrast, today, more and more biblical scholars are exploring the positive uses of comparative studies. And as a result of a half century of the persistent scholarship of Assyriologists and Hittitologists and Egyptologists and Sumerologists, we're now in a position to add significant nuances to the paradigms for studying the impact of the ancient Near East on the authors and editors of the Hebrew Bible. And the end result, says Walton, is a more thorough and comprehensive understanding of the text. I would say certainly an amen to that. The reality is that even great thinkers like Augustine or Calvin or Luther or anybody in that list and more, many of those, especially those centuries removed from us today, just simply did not have access to this kind of material, the comparative cultural material. They could not get their minds, their heads into the worldview of the biblical writers because they had no way of tapping into the broader culture of which the biblical writers were invariably a part. They just didn't have it. So it's not a question of modern scholars being smarter than those other guys. It's a question of what we have access to. We need a thorough exposure to the ancient Near Eastern mind and worldview to help us interpret the Bible. And frankly, it will do that in some fundamental ways. So how do we do that, though? How can we get our heads into that worldview, into the Old Testament writer's worldview? How can we think like a pre-modern person living between the 2nd millennium BC and the 1st century AD? The most immediate path, and when I say immediate, I don't mean that it's not work, because it is. The most immediate path is to absorb the literature of the ancient Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, Hittites, Phoenicians, Canaanites, on and on, to absorb that material. So we need to do that for really two reasons. We'll just say two fundamental reasons. Exposure to the literature means exposure to worldview. This goes beyond pots and pans and brick and mortar. Again, the material culture that archaeologists can give us. Of course, archaeologists gave us the text as well. But we need exposure to literature and worldview. Just like our day, how people think and what they believe is revealed through what they write, through what they produce intellectually. Now, they didn't have movies or TV or the internet, but they wrote things down, and studying the literature of those cultures is the gateway to thinking their thoughts after them and being immersed mentally in their worldview. Second thought is we need to take that exposure to that knowledge. We need to take all that with us to the biblical text, and it will give us interpretive clarity in two ways. First, it'll make the odd or the weird passage decipherable. And that's really achieved by noticing sameness, things that the ancient Near Eastern writer would say and would believe that really overlap to the biblical material. We see things that are the same, and they help us decipher what the biblical writer is saying because we can compare it to something else. So the overlap, the similarities really help make the odd stuff decipherable. But second, if you know all that stuff, if you have the intellectual world of the ancient Near East in your head, floating around in your head, it makes the divergent material discernible. That is, you can spot the differences a mile away when you're conversant with the typical way that an ancient person would think, an ancient pagan would think, because then you can spot the theological differences, the theological nuggets that are part of the Israelite worldview, that are part of the Bible, that the biblical writer wanted to communicate. They will just stand out. You'll know when they're making a statement. Now, how do we do that? There are two kinds of resources for doing this. One is very obviously the ancient literature itself. And we, in living in our time, get exposed to that through guides that scholars have produced, guides to ancient literature that more or less just expose us to what's out there. I mean, what kind of literature is out there, and in terms of categories or topics, how does it overlap with what we see in the Bible? We also get access to ancient literature through texts in translation, English translations of all that stuff. So that's the first kind of resource, the stuff that gets us to the ancient literature itself, guides and then English translations. Second kind of resource is some sort of informed discussion of all that ancient literature and its application to biblical study. And we get that through things like specialized dictionaries or reference works. I'm thinking here of something like the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. It's loaded with comparative material. So there's specialized reference works. There are monographs, that is, books on specific topics related to the intersection of the biblical world and all this ancient Near Eastern or Mediterranean material. And then there are academic commentaries. A good scholarly commentary will be informed, the writer will be informed of specific passages and places in the text that are illuminated and just made decipherable by comparative ancient Near Eastern material. And he'll work that material, he'll discuss that material into his commentary in the biblical text. Now, as we wind up our time for this episode, on the podcast website right now, you would just go to www.nakedbiblepodcast.com. I've posted links to several books that are excellent guides to the background literature of the Bible, both Testaments. And again, that's the first kind of resource for getting us into the ancient literature itself. The background literature for the Old Testament, of course, is stuff written by Egyptians and Sumerians and Akkadians and Babylonians and so on. So go to www.nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the tab marked Bibliography and Resources. Those works are the place to start. Now, in the next episode, I'll be exposing you to resources in terms of both books and links online that will get you to the actual literature of these cultures. And of course, Hellenistic Judaism, again, all the wider ancient Mediterranean world that really matters for both Old and New Testament, their own original context. I'll get you to that material in English translation. And then in episodes after that, I'll introduce you to material that every student can access that provides the second category we just talked about, that provides informed discussion of all that ancient literature and its application to biblical study. The last episode of the podcast dealt with the need to tap into the intellectual output of the ancient Mediterranean world, the Bible's own context, in order to start thinking the thoughts of the biblical writers. Specifically, the literature of the ancient Near East and the Second Temple Hellenistic Judaism period was the primary means at our disposal to become informed by the worldview of the biblical writers of the Old and New Testaments. I posted some links to academic books designed to be guides to this literature. In this episode, I want to take this recommendation further by directing listeners to the best volumes and websites for English translations of all this material. We'll start with the civilizations that give the Old Testament its context, the civilizations of the ancient Near East. In the episode that follows this one, we'll cover the Second Temple period, the primary context for the New Testament. In what follows in this episode, I'll first recommend books, whether hard copy or digital form, that must be purchased. After those recommendations, I'll suggest some websites that have free content for text and English translation. So let's start with books.
The designation Ancient Near East is used to describe the civilizations of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, which is Asia Minor or what would now be considered Turkey, Canaan, Syria, which is a more modern term for ancient Ugarit, and Phoenicia, which was also known as Byblos or associated with Byblos, and the Transjordanian countries of Moab, Ammon, and Edom. Mesopotamia is further broken down into the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian civilizations. And Anatolia is primarily describing the Hittite civilization. All of these cultures, especially Egypt, Sumer, Babylon, Assyria, and Ugarit, produced a good deal of literature, including everything from economic receipts, bills of sale, laws, personal letters, mythic epics, religious rituals, theological texts, and poetry about love and human suffering. But how can an English reader get into all that? Well, there are a number of print volumes that provide a broad exposure to this literature in English translation. I'll list the ones I recommend and whether those volumes are also available in digital form from Logos Bible Software, whose website is www.logos.com. You can check the links for all of these resources, whether they're books or digital form, at the Bibliography and Resources tab at the Naked Bible Podcast website, and that is www.nakedbiblepodcast.com. First, there are general collections that include texts from all these cultures, not just focusing on one civilization. First, there's something called the Context of Scripture, or what's known in the field as COS, C-O-S. This is a 3-volume set. It's also available in digital form through Logos. Now, COS is currently considered the most up-to-date academic English anthology for ancient Near Eastern texts. Since it covers all the civilizations, it is by definition selective in what it includes and therefore not exhaustive. But it gives you literary examples, works from civilizations all across the ancient Near East. Second, there's Pritchard's Ancient Near Eastern Texts, known as ANET. This is a 1-volume edition of texts that is sold in hard copy, and it's pretty expensive, but you can get the material now in a 2-volume paperback set that's much cheaper. Now, ANET also has an accompanying volume of pictures, but we're concerned right now with just the primary texts. ANET is also available digitally through Logos. Like COS, the Context of Scripture, it is selective and covers fewer texts than COS does because it's only 1 volume as opposed to 3 volumes for the Context of Scripture. Before COS came along, this was the industry standard volume for ancient Near Eastern texts in translation. Third, there's the Society of Biblical Literature's series called Writings from the Ancient World. This is a 16-volume set. It's only available as a set if you want it digitally from Logos, but you can buy individual volumes in hard copy form on sites like Amazon.com. Now, some of the volumes in this set would include Letters from Ancient Egypt. That's 1 volume. There's a volume on Hittite myths. There's another one called Letters from Early Mesopotamia. Another one called Texts from the Amarna Period in Egypt. Now, the Amarna period was the period of Akhenaten, later New Kingdom. There's Hittite diplomatic texts, Mesopotamian chronicles, ritual and cult at Ugarit, Hittite prayers, text from the Pyramid Age, and so on and so forth. There's also a volume that covers the Ugaritic epic material called Ugaritic narrative poetry. Again, Writings from the Ancient World is 16 volumes in all, and the only way you can get individual volumes is to buy them in book form. Now those are the general collections. Let's move now to individual civilizations. We'll take ancient Egypt first. Aside from the volumes in the SBL Writings in the Ancient World series, there are several anthologies just of Egyptian literature. One is the 3-volume set by Miriam Lichtheim, an Egyptologist. This is called Ancient Egyptian Literature, Volume 1, 2, and 3. These are available in digital form from Logos, and they're available in paperback from a site like Amazon, and they're not expensive. They're divided between the Old and Middle Kingdom, that's Volume 1, then the New Kingdom, and then the Late Period. Another example is Ancient Egyptian Literature, an anthology by John L. Foster. Again, it's a 1-volume work, so again, its coverage might not be as much as Lichtheim, 3 volumes in paperback, but it is another well-known anthology. Thirdly, there's another anthology called The Literature of Ancient Egypt, and this is by several Egyptologists, William Kelly Simpson from Yale, Robert Rittner, Vincent Tobin, and retired Professor Edward Wente from the University of Chicago. It is just what it sounds like, an anthology. It includes stories, instructions, which is what we would call Egyptian wisdom literature. There are monumental inscriptions, autobiographies, poetry. It's a pretty broad spectrum. If you get that, make sure you get the latest edition, the 3rd edition. If we move now to Mesopotamia, the best set here that focuses just on Mesopotamian materials, Sumerian material, Babylonian material, Assyrian material, and again, other than Sumerian, the rest of that stuff is in the language known as Akkadian. The best set here is the 2-volume set called Before the Muses, an anthology of Akkadian literature by Benjamin R. Foster. Now that set is quite exhaustive. It's very good. It's something that scholars would use. There's actually a distillation of that set, the 2-volume set, into one paperback volume. It's the 1-volume work is called From Distant Days, Myths, Tales, and Poetry of Ancient Mesopotamia. And the material in that is sort of pulled from the larger set Before the Muses. It's also by Benjamin R. Foster. So he selected the major things from the 2-volume set to put into the 1-volume set. I used that book for the Mesopotamia class I taught at the local university. Another 1-volume work is Stephanie Dalley's Myths from Mesopotamia. This was published in 1989. Stephanie Dalley is a well-known scholar in Mesopotamian studies. It's a nice little paperback, not expensive at all, and it'll cover all the major creation epics, the flood epics, Gilgamesh, that sort of thing. I should also mention Thorkild Jakobsson's The Harps That Once. This is a work subtitled Sumerian Poetry in Translation. Jakobsson was a well-known Sumerian scholar, and this book focuses on the poetic epic myths in Sumerian literature. Again, creation epics and that sort of thing. So it's somewhat dated, but Jakobsson was a major figure in Sumerian studies, and so it's well worthwhile to have his translations. Ugaritic literature, we can focus on that in particular. Aside from the volume in the Writings from the Ancient World series, which is by Simon Parker and entitled Ugaritic Narrative Poetry, aside from that, there are 3 other books that provide English translations of the Ugaritic epic material, things like the Baal Cycle, the Keret Epic, or the Achat Cycle. These are Nicholas Wyatt's Religious Texts from Ugarit. That's also available digitally from Logos. John C. L. Gibson's Canaanite Myths and Legends, also available from Logos, and that volume includes a number of the Rephaim texts as well, in addition to the major epics. And finally, There's Michael Coogan and Mark Smith, their volume called Stories from Ancient Canaan, the second edition. Again, if you get that work, make sure you get the second edition. Now, for the literature produced by the Hittites, the Phoenicians, the Moabites, all the smaller Transjordanian civilizations, the best thing you can do is get access to KOS, Context of Scripture, or ANET, Ancient Near Eastern Texts. There are no separate works that really focus specifically on these smaller civilizations. Let's talk a little bit about websites where you can get access to material for free. Now, naturally, online resources are, as you'd expect, not as good as the published volumes. For one thing, they're often quite old, they're in public domain, and so you don't get the benefit of the most recent research and the results of that reflected in newer, more recent translations. You're also dependent on your own searching in most cases, since these websites may or may not have the material organized in any coherent way and just require you to put in your own search terms to find whatever it is they have. But there's still a lot of good stuff there, so I don't want you to be completely discouraged about that. You'd be surprised at what's available. I'm going to give you 3 sites that are useful for accessing primary text for free in the public domain. One is a site called ETANA. That's ETANA. It stands for Electronic Tools and Ancient Near East Archives. www.etana.org. What you do when you go to this website, you select core texts from the tabs at the top, and then type in a subject word or a keyword in advanced search. For instance, if I type in Egypt, I would find things like James Henry Breasted's 5-volume work on ancient records of Egypt. These are historical documents from all periods of ancient Egyptian history. And there are things in Breasted that aren't published in any other work, either in public domain or the recent collections. This was a very important set, and actually still is. Breasted was an Egyptologist at the University of Chicago for many years. If I put in the keyword translation, I get things like Leonard King's 2-volume work, The 7 Tablets of Creation. That's an old, done in the 19-teens, or just after the turn of the 1900s. It's an old translation of Babylonian creation stories. Now, while you're on the ETANA website, you may want to also click on the tab that says ABZU. That's ABZU. These are free academic books collected from the web that cover all sorts of topics about the ancient Near East. Now, you won't find core texts on ABZU. You'd have to use the ETANA search engine for that. But you will find thousands of books about the ancient Near East that are free, along with lots of other links to other sites, again, just depending on your search terms. Thirdly, on the ETANA website, there's also a news site known as eTact. That's ETACT. It's just another tab on the ETANA website. And this site is, as its own wording explains, the site aims to be the definitive repository on the web for translations of Akkadian materials. So if you're on the ETANA website, click on eTact, click on that tab, and then you'll be taken to a page where you can browse that particular collection by category. Now, the second major site I want to direct you to is the Internet Sacred Texts Archive. And make sure you access the index. And you can do that again by going up to nakedbiblepodcast.com, clicking on Bibliography and Resources, and then hitting the link for Internet Sacred Texts Archive. This is really quite a good site in that someone, whoever runs this site, has really taken the time, it's been up for years, to cull the web for English translations of all sorts of ancient texts, not just the ancient Near East. And the best part about it is it's actually given some sort of coherent topical arrangement so that it's not something that you're totally dependent on searching with your own keywords. So I highly recommend that to get to public domain material and websites that have English translations of these ancient Near Eastern texts on them. Third, there's something called the Internet Archive. The Internet Archive is an archive of free public domain resources on basically any subject that you can think of. It's not just about ancient studies. It's about anything that's available for free, either public domain or available for free otherwise. The Internet Archive. So once you're on that page, you search for key terms and you'll get access to books that have been scanned and made available because they're in public domain or converted to PDF. It's a very useful website, and you'll find lots of material on that. I hope this is helpful. Just remember to visit www.nakedbiblepodcast.com and then click on the Bibliography and Resources tab for links to all the resources I described here. In the next episode that follows, we'll take a look at the same sorts of resources for the Second Temple period, the primary context for the New Testament. We're still in the early stages of a series on Bible study. We began the series talking about how essential it is to interpret the Bible in its own context, that context being the world of the ancient Near East with respect to the Old Testament, and the Second Temple period with respect to the New Testament. Interpreting the Bible in these contexts means thinking like a person living at these times in these places. The best way to do that is to immerse yourself in the worldview of the civilizations of these eras with which the biblical writers had regular contact. And the best way to become familiar with how these people thought, and therefore how the biblical writers thought, either in agreement or in divergence from their neighbors, is to read the intellectual output of these other cultures. That means getting into their written sources. The last episode of the podcast dealt with the need to tap into the written material of the ancient Near East, since that is the context for the Old Testament. In this episode, we'll turn attention to the New Testament context, the Second Temple period. As in the last episode, I'll introduce you to print and online sources for reading those texts in English translation. Now, as we begin, we should be clear on some terminology and exactly what literature we're talking about. The Second Temple period refers to the period in Israel's history right after the nation returned from exile in Babylon and built a new temple in Jerusalem. The first temple was, of course, Solomon's temple, and that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 586 BC. Israel was allowed to return to her homeland in 539 BC. Shortly thereafter, work began on building a new temple, the Second Temple. That temple was completed in 516 BC. And it stood until 70 AD, when the Roman Emperor Titus destroyed it. The Second Temple period, therefore, technically runs from 516 BC to 70 AD. However, most scholars use the term a bit more broadly, of the time period encompassing the 6th century BC through the 1st century AD. Now, only a handful of biblical books were written during this period. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther are the obvious ones, but not the only ones. Many scholars would also assign parts of Isaiah, Zechariah, and Daniel to this period as well. But typically, when scholars talk about Second Temple Jewish literature, they aren't talking about biblical books. They are talking about non-biblical Jewish religious texts written during this time period, books that today we group into collections, with labels like Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. Now, the former term, the Apocrypha, contains books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Tobit, the Wisdom of Sirach, additions to the Book of Daniel, and the Prayer of Manasseh. Outside academia, Apocrypha, though, is a term used by Protestants, as Protestants don't consider any of these books canonical or inspired as sacred texts. The Roman Catholic Church, on the other hand, considers some of them as canonical along with the books of the Protestant Bible. These books are referred to by Catholics as deuterocanonical to reflect that belief. The latter term, pseudepigrapha,
is a collection created by scholars of books not found in the Bible or in the Apocrypha, into which other books of the Second Temporal period are placed. Perhaps the most familiar of the pseudepigrapha would be the book of 1st Enoch, although books like Jubilees and the letter of Aristeas and Joseph and Asenath might be familiar as well. Now, pseudepigrapha does not mean false writings. You'll often see that. Many of these books were influential within the believing Jewish and Christian communities when you get into the first century, including some New Testament writers, despite the fact that they were not considered inspired or canonical. The term really refers to the fact that the names on these books, for example, 1st Enoch, do not reflect their true authorship. So in other words, 1st Enoch was not written by Enoch. There's no evidence to suggest that. Aside from the Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, Second Temple Jewish literature also encompasses the Dead Sea Scrolls and the writings of Flavius Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, both very important writers for serious Jews during the Second Temple period. So where can the English reader find good translations of all this literature? Well, we'll start with print books for each category and then move on to websites. Of course, print books means you have to pay for the content, and the websites you don't. But there are some downsides with websites as well. So let's start with Old Testament Apocrypha, again called Deuterocanonicals by the Roman Catholic Church. We mentioned a few of these books, the books of Maccabees, Tobit, Wisdom of Solomon, Wisdom of Sirach, so on and so forth. In hard copy, and some of these, I'll tell you right away, are also found in digital version through software. I'll give you a few recommendations of translations in English that I think are of good quality. And don't forget, just like the last episode, you can find all of these titles with links to where you can obtain them on the Naked Bible Podcast website. You just go up to www.nakedbiblepodcast.com and then look for the tab that says Bibliography and Resources, and you'll see the links there. So, Old Testament Apocrypha. If you just want a simple English translation of the Apocrypha, there are two that are commonly used today. One is the King James Version of the Apocrypha. And again, it's just the books of the Apocrypha that were included in the King James Version translation in 1611 or thereabouts. Now, that might surprise some of you that weren't aware that the King James translation included books of the Apocrypha, but it did. And you can buy certain editions of the King James and get those, or you can buy just the apocryphal books in one volume, one small volume. Another resource would be the NRSV. Now, the NRSV translation also included the books of the Apocrypha. And again, on the Naked Bible Podcast website, I have a link to the NRSV annotated edition of the Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha is pretty easy to find in print, or again, these works are going to be available in digital form through Logos Bible software. There's also an edition by R.H. Charles. He has a 2-volume set. One volume is the Apocrypha, the second volume is the pseudepigrapha. And Charles' work is more recent than the King James, obviously, because the King James is very old. Charles would have been writing in the early 1900s, but it's not as recent as the NRSV. But the Charles edition you will often see referenced. And in fact, if you get the electronic version from Logos, you can also get Charles' commentaries on these books, Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, and some notes and things like that in digital form. But you should be aware, and again I have it linked on the podcast website, that you can get Charles's edition, volume 1 of his 2-volume set of the Apocrypha by itself. Now, I should mention the New Testament Apocrypha. To be honest, this isn't really pertinent to the biblical context, because the New Testament Apocrypha were books that were written in the early Christian era. so it's a little bit beyond the context of the New Testament itself, but some people might be thinking of Apocrypha with respect to New Testament books. And what I mean by that is you'll get New Testament apocryphal works that would be like other Gospels. Now, these are not the Nag Hammadi Coptic, the Gnostic Gospels, but you have other Gospels. You have other lost books that were considered heretical. You have different versions of the Passion called Passion Gospels. You have secondary book of Acts. You've got epistles of Peter. You've got a whole body of literature that bears some relationship, usually just the name, to New Testament characters or New Testament events. And then, again, whole books were written about that. So there are New Testament Apocrypha. Probably the cheapest and best one-volume edition is that of M.R. James, the Apocryphal New Testament. However, and that is available, I should mention, that's available in digital form through Logos as well. However, the scholarly reference edition for New Testament Apocrypha is the 2-volume set by Schneemelcher. Again, 2 volumes. They're expensive. They're each around $45 or $50, but they are pretty exhaustive. They're excellent if you really want all or basically anything that would conceivably be lumped into the category of New Testament Apocrypha. If you want those works, this is the set to have. So 2 volumes by Schneemelcher. Moving on to the Pseudepigrapha, you can get an edition of the Pseudepigrapha, as I mentioned a few moments ago, through R.H. Charles. Again, Charles had a 2-volume companion set. One was Apocrypha, the other was Pseudepigrapha. You can buy them separately, or you can buy them as a set. So Charles has an edition of the Apocrypha. Probably the go-to resource when it comes to Pseudepigrapha is the 2-volume set by James H. Charlesworth. Now, distinguish the names. Charles and Charlesworth are 2 different people in 2 different sets. So Charlesworth's 2-volume set was published by Doubleday. It's now, I believe, under the Yale, Anchor Yale label. But this is the major academic resource for Pseudepigrapha in English translation. These 2 volumes also contain fairly detailed introductions and textual histories of all of the books of the Pseudepigrapha. So if you're at all interested in the Pseudepigrapha, these are very, very much worth having. And both Charles' Charles' collection of the Pseudepigrapha, and Charlesworth's 2-volume set are available in digital form from Logos. Now let's move to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and right away we need to distinguish the scrolls. There are basically 2 kinds of Dead Sea Scrolls. Biblical Dead Sea Scrolls, which would be material from the Hebrew Bible found at Qumran, in other words, copies, different textual traditions of the Hebrew Bible itself. Those are the biblical scrolls. And then there are non-biblical scrolls, other books, that were found at Qumran. And frankly, most of the Dead Sea Scroll material is non-biblical. So when people usually talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're usually not talking about the manuscripts that are related to the textual history of the Hebrew Bible. They're usually talking about documents that the Qumran community themselves wrote, or other books, for instance, fragments of First Enoch found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Other books that had a circulation within Judaism that were copied and kept at Qumran, the place where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So, with respect to the non-biblical Dead Sea Scrolls, there are some good English translations, good English editions of these. The one I would recommend most is that by Wise, Abegg, and Cook, 3 editors. Make sure if you select this resource, get the most recent edition. There was just a new edition that came out. So Wise, Abegg, and Cook, their translation. There's another often frequently used set of English translations by Geza Worms, and you spell his last name Vermes. His edition is widely available and widely used as well. Then there's another English translation by Garcia Martinez, and I've put this in here mainly because of the digital edition. Now the other two, the one by Wise, Abegg, and Cook, you can get that in digital form through Logos. You can get Worm's edition through Logos, but it's quite expensive because of the publisher. And Garcia Martinez's comes in a 2-volume digital set. This is just the digital now that I'm talking about, the 2 volumes. If you want just the English translation, you can get that in print in 1 volume. But if you go digital, you can get the Qumran texts in English in a product called the Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition. You get the English translation and you get the Hebrew text with notes. So that's a very nice handy set to have because you get both languages there. Now, as far as the biblical scrolls, I'm going to recommend one work, and that is something called the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. Again, this is a little bit peripheral to capturing the context of the New Testament since it's just biblical material, but I'm going to mention it anyway. The Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, edited by Abegg, Flint, and Ulrich. This is a collection and an English translation of all the biblical scrolls so that once they're translated into English, this is the oldest known Old Testament translated into English. And the way they have it set up is when you're looking at the translation, you'll be able to tell by verse reference what portions of your Old Testament were in the Dead Sea Scrolls and then portions that were not found there, because the manuscripts found at Qumran of the Hebrew Bible are incomplete because they're just in a state of decay or disrepair, or they were fragmentary for some other reason. They're thousands of years old, so it's not all going to be intact. But the edition does a nice job of showing you visually what was there, and then you can tell what wasn't there as far as the discovery. So the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, if you want a Dead Sea Scrolls English Old Testament, that is the volume to get. And that's also available in digital form. Now, moving on to Josephus. Josephus really is known for 4 works. One is called the Jewish War. It's an account of the war of the Jews against the Romans. His other major work was called the Jewish Antiquities. It's a 20-volume set. It's a historiographical work. It's the history of Jewish people from Adam to the Jewish war with Rome. His third work was called The Life, and that's an autobiography. And then lastly, there's something called Against Apion, which was Josephus's refutation of anti-Semitic writings circulating during his time, or roughly contemporaneous with him. Now, all of these volumes, all of these works, the 4 works and all their volumes are available in English translation. The Whiston edition, if you get this in print, get the newest edition, is available. It's a full English translation of all the works of Josephus. This is available in digital form as well from Logos. Paul Meyer has a translation of the works of Josephus. You spell his last name Maier. That is not available in digital form, but it's a recent collection and translation of Josephus. Philo, let's talk about Philo before we go to websites. Again, Philo was an important Jewish theological, religious, and philosophical writer during the 1st century. I have a quote here from a Philo scholar and a Targumic scholar as well, rabbinics as well. Martin McNamara says, quote, Philo's chief interest is in the allegorical interpretation of the Scriptures. It's kind of what he's known for. The titles of his works show that his thoughts centered around or flowed from the sacred text. However, he can be studied as both a philosopher and an exegete. Central to his teaching on God's relationship to the world is his doctrine of the Logos. The term itself occurs repeatedly in his works, but is never actually defined, unquote. Again, the Logos is a New Testament concept that we know from the Gospel of John, where he refers to Jesus as the Logos. And so that's one of the main reasons Philo draws a lot of attention, this sort of intermediary being, speaking as and writing as a Jew who was a monotheist, but Philo's idea of the Logos is pretty important. So Philo wrote a lot of other things too. He has a book on the giants, the giant lore, that sort of thing. He has a very wide range of interest and works, and you can get the works of Philo. The edition by Yonge, that's Yonge, which was updated by David Scholer, Scholer. You can get that on Amazon, and that's available as well through Logos. So there's a nice edition in English of the works of Philo, the complete works. Now let's move to websites in the time we have remaining. These are free, of course, but the problem with websites is that they're sometimes incomplete. You don't always get all the books. And the translations are dated. They're usually from old public domain sources. And public domain is anything before, I think, currently 1927. So they're not recent. They don't incorporate recent scholarship into them. But for their day, they were very good sources. So as far as the Old Testament Apocrypha, you could go to the Sacred Texts Archive. They have a little section for Old Testament Apocrypha books. Something called the non-canonical homepage. And again, these are all on the Naked Bible Podcast website, ready for you to click on the links and go there. But the non-canonical homepage. Then there's another site called apocrypha.org that has links to Apocrypha books in English translation. Also, pseudepigrapha.com. Now, this site, which you would think is about the pseudepigrapha, and it is, but it's about more than the pseudepigrapha. If you go to pseudepigrapha.com, you'll also find links to the Apocrypha there. And with respect to the pseudepigrapha, naturally, you'd go to pseudepigrapha.com. You could also go to the Sacred Text Archive, but if you go to the Sacred Text Archive link, you should note that that site labels the books of the pseudepigrapha as quote-unquote other apocrypha, so it's a little confusing. The non-canonical homepage has a page dedicated with links to all the books of the pseudepigrapha in English, so you could go to the non-canonical homepage. And for New Testament Apocrypha, you would go to a site called Early Christian Writings. And pseudepigrapha.com also has links to some New Testament apocryphal books. The works of Philo can be found on the Early Jewish Writings website, as is the case for all the works of Josephus, the Early Jewish Writings website. And again, just go up to www.nakedbiblepodcast.com. All these things are already linked for you so that you can get there quickly and start reading. Well, I hope this is helpful to be exposed to these resources. In the next episode of the podcast, what I'm going to do is go back to the Old Testament and start recommending books that are written by scholars for interested non-specialists that really distill and digest and order in a systematic way the content of the literature of the ancient Near East, in the Old Testament's case, and of course when we get to New Testament, of the Second Temple period. There are lots of books out there that are excellent for helping you understand this body of ancient literature. Now, I still recommend that you read a lot of it yourself, but there are books out there that really organize information well into very specific topics, where you can find good essays on what Josephus thought about a given topic, or what the Egyptians thought about the afterlife, or Mesopotamian cosmology. There's all sorts of things that you can read so that you can begin, again, to think like a person who lived during these periods. And then we're going to talk about taking that back to the Bible to gain clarity and understanding of the Bible itself in its own context. Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. We're still in the early stages of a series on Bible study. We began the series talking about how essential it is to interpret the Bible in its own context. That context, of course, being the world of the ancient Near East with respect to the Old Testament, and the Second Temple period with respect to the New Testament. Interpreting the Bible in these contexts means thinking like a person living at these times, which the biblical writers did. The best way to do that is to immerse yourself in the worldview of the civilizations of these eras with which the biblical writers had regular contact and which they were a part of. We've already spent several episodes on my recommendations for accessing the texts of the ancient Near East and Second Temple period, the intellectual output of the civilizations and cultures that formed the original context of the Old and New Testaments. In this episode and the next, I want to recommend the best books and reference works for understanding the religion and culture of the ancient Near East and Second Temple periods. Scholars who are steeped in this material have produced many essays explaining the worldview of these civilizations and how that worldview matters for biblical study and interpretation. I want to direct you to the best of those resources. As is our pattern, we'll devote this episode to the ancient Near East, the context for the Old Testament, before moving to the Second Temple period, the context for the New Testament, in the next episode of the podcast. And as always, you'll find links to these resources at www.nakedbiblepodcast.com under the Bibliography and Resources tab. Let's start with the books that I recommend most for Old Testament study, keeping the Old Testament in its ancient Near Eastern context. And these are really reference works. One of the best sets that you can get, because it covers virtually all areas of religion and culture and history, things like, poetry and medicine and science, pretty much everything you could think of that would be part of a person's world in the ancient world, in one set, as it pertains to the ancient Near East, is a set called Civilizations of the Ancient Near East. And the editor is a fellow named Jack Sasson. That's Sasson. Now, originally this was published in 4 volumes. You can purchase it now in a 2-volume set. It's a little expensive, but there's really nothing better that I could recommend. And every once in a while, you'll find this set, the 2 volumes, the 4 volumes in 2 volumes, on sale on Amazon or used bookstore or something like Christian Book Distributors. I got my set for less than $100, and it's been well worth it. The next set I'd recommend is a set that is published by InterVarsity Press. These are the Dictionary of the Old Testament series. There are 4 volumes. The 4th volume just was released this past month. And this is a wonderful set. It breaks the Old Testament up into the Pentateuch, that's 1 volume, historical books is another, wisdom, poetry, and writings is a 3rd, and then the Old Testament prophets is a 4th. Now, this is a dictionary set aimed at the Old Testament, the academic study of the Old Testament, but the articles within them on any given subject really pay attention to the ancient Near Eastern worldview of which the Old Testament is a part. And if I could put a personal plug in here, there are great articles in the Wisdom, Poetry, and Writings volume and the Prophets volume on the Divine Council. You can guess why I'm recommending that, because I wrote them. I also have 2 articles in the Prophets volume on chaos and destruction. So you can tell just by those kinds of articles, especially chaos and destruction, that these dictionaries are really aimed at Old Testament symbols, Old Testament motifs, the kinds of things that Old Testament writers are using. You'll see them in the Old Testament, but they have a very wide but specific context in the ancient world in which a biblical writer lived and wrote. And these reference works, this series by InterVarsity, is just wonderful for helping you get right to the heart of the matter in any given topic as it relates to Old Testament study. Now, the last reference work that I think is essential, that I just think is just top of the line, is the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. Now, if you've been paying attention to any of my websites for any amount of time, you have heard of this resource before. I often tell people this is probably the only reference work that I have that I could just read cover to cover. And I've read most of it. There's just nothing like it. It's specifically aimed at divine beings, anything that sort of relates to gods and angels and all sorts of otherworldly, spiritual realm sorts of topics in the Old Testament. And every entry is written by someone versed, with their eye tuned to the ancient Near Eastern context. And this reference work I'll also recommend when we get to the New Testament or the Second Temple podcast, because they do the same thing. The writers in this volume, if they're writing on something that pertains to New Testament study, they are deeply entrenched in Second Temple period sources that really help you. So this is just a wonderful set. Now, with respect to specific books that you would not, call reference works or multi-volume reference works anyway, there are really two types. There are recommended books that help you understand and learn about a particular civilization in the ancient Near East, let's say ancient Egypt. And then there are books that do what those reference works do. There are individual volumes on specific issues that will take ancient Near Eastern material and relate it immediately to the Old Testament. So I want to cover both. With respect to books about the ancient Near East, when it comes to history and culture, I have some recommendations. When I say history and culture, I mean the flow of the history of these civilizations. And when I say culture, part of that is religion, but I'm going to give you some specific titles that are just about ancient Near Eastern religion. But part of the culture is the religion, but again, it's science, it's how normal people lived, in everyday life in the ancient Near East, how they made a living, how they cooked, what they ate, what they wore. It could be how their government worked, their institutions. It's wider than just religion, but religion is a special interest of mine, so I'll be hitting those separately. But just for history and culture, ancient Near East, I recommend the following. The book by Al Hurt and other editors are Mattingly and Yamauchi. It's called Peoples of the Old Testament World. And this is just what it sounds like. Every chapter takes another culture group, another civilization of the Old Testament world, and gives you a complete overview of that civilization. Things like there'd be a chapter on the Edomites, there'd be a chapter on the Moabites, and the Ammonites, along with the Egyptians and the Babylonians, and so on and so forth. It's a very good resource in one volume. White's book on everyday life in ancient Egypt is highly recommended, as is its counterpart by Bertman, Handbook to Life in Ancient Mesopotamia. These two books do a nice job of covering everyday life in ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia. Von Soden's introduction to the ancient Near East, called The Ancient Orient, is also excellent. He has a chapter on all facets of ancient Near Eastern culture. Now, he excludes Egypt. He's an Assyriologist by training, or he was, and so his focus is on Sumerians and Babylonians and the Assyrians, that sort of thing. But that's an excellent introduction. Barbara Mertz's book, Red Land, Black Land, Daily Life in Ancient Egypt, is also excellent. It's written for the non-specialists, and it's sort of written in non-academic language, but it definitely has academic content. Red Land, Black Land, Daily Life in Ancient Egypt by Barbara Mertz. Two histories I would recommend, both by the same author, Mark van de Meerup, A History of Ancient Egypt, and then A History of the Ancient Near East. Of course, the one on ancient Egypt is focused on ancient Egyptian history, and the other volume is the rest of the ancient Near East. mainly Mesopotamia, but also the civilizations with which Mesopotamia had contact with other than Egypt, things like the Hittites and the Mitanni and so on and so forth. So those are excellent volumes. I actually used both of those volumes in the undergraduate courses I taught at the local college here on ancient Egypt and on ancient Mesopotamia. Let's talk about religion. Ancient Mesopotamian religion, there are some major works that anyone who's interested really should have and read. Tammy Schneider has an introduction to ancient Mesopotamian religion. There's no such thing as a systematic theology of ancient Mesopotamian religion or ancient Egyptian religion, but her book actually arranges things in some familiar ways, topical ways. She'll have a section on religious ritual. She'll have a section on religious calendar. She'll have a section on the gods of the pantheon, the divine council in ancient Mesopotamia, that sort of thing. So it's a nice survey. Jean Bottero, Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia, is also quite good. It's a little more academic than Schneider in terms of the way it's written, but the content of both you can trust. Jakobson's book called The Treasures of Darkness, A History of Mesopotamian Religion. Jakobson was a Sumerian scholar, and this book really aims to sort of understand the religious epics of ancient Sumer and ancient Mesopotamia in sort of a developmental way, how these works demonstrate the development of Mesopotamian religious ideas. Black's book, this is a little slim one-volume book called The Gods, Demons, and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia, an illustrated dictionary. So it is sort of a reference work, but it's one volume. I thought I would include it here because it's solely focused on religion. The entries are short, but the bibliography information is good as well. If you wanted to start with one of them, one of these four, I would start with Black just to give you a basic orientation and then move on to one of the others. As far as ancient Egyptian religion, Pinch has two recommended volumes. One is Egyptian Myth, A Very Short Introduction. This is part of the Very Short Introduction series by Oxford. Again, this goes through all the major Egyptian religious myths, the mythic epics, and gives you an overview of what's going on there, what Egyptians thought about their own history and the activity of the gods in the primeval times, and so on and so forth. Her other book is called Egyptian Mythology, A Guide to the Gods, Goddesses, and Traditions of Ancient Egypt. It's a fuller version of her short introduction book. The one I would most recommend here is by Emily Teeter, Religion and Ritual in Ancient Egypt. Again, there is no systematic theology of ancient Egyptian religion, but again, I really like the way she categorizes things in groups, topics, to go through the breadth of ancient Egyptian religion. It's not just about their mythologies, about how the gods created everything and then how Egypt came about. It's just much broader. It really covers everything: priesthood, liturgy, all that sort of thing, Egyptian magic. It's the best thing I think there is right now on it. If you can get the book by Stephen Quirke, it's Quirke, on ancient Egyptian religion, I highly recommend that as well. But that's out of print, but you may see it in a used bookstore online somewhere. Now, as far as Old Testament Israel, specific books, again, rather than multi-volume reference work, but specific books that focus on Old Testament Israel, and even more precisely, understanding the Old Testament in light of its original culture, which, of course, means the broader ancient Near East, and also culture in ancient Canaan. Again, this orientation is the biblical worldview. It is the biblical context. Our contexts, no matter how familiar they are to us, are foreign to the Bible. And these sorts of works will really help you frame the context of the Bible correctly. These are the ones that are going to be written by people who are steeped in ancient Mesopotamian religion or ancient Egyptian religion, those other books that I just mentioned. And then they're going to write these works specifically focused on ancient Israel and distill a lot of that ancient Near Eastern information for you and apply it directly to the Bible. The best volume here, if you don't buy anything else I mentioned, I recommend this one above all others, and that is John Walton's Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament. The subtitle is Introducing the Conceptual World of the Hebrew Bible, and the title says it all. It tells you just what the book is about. He's going to go through all aspects of ancient Near Eastern and Old Testament thought, prophecy, cosmology, law, ritual, the afterlife, all these sorts of topics, again, showing you how the ancient Near East informs your reading of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Walton has another book I recommend here just on cosmology in Genesis 1, and that is The Lost World of Genesis 1, Ancient Cosmology and the Origins Debate. It's excellent. If you've been in Memra courses, you've read this, we've used this, I've blogged about it before. I have some minor disagreements with Walton, but I heartily recommend the book. To me, viewing Genesis 1 for what it is, an ancient Near Eastern creation story, really undermines the whole debate about how we understand Genesis. The answer to that question is we ought to understand Genesis for what it was when it was written, in its own context, not our context, scientific or otherwise. Now, Israelite religion. There's a very good survey book that is often used in undergraduate courses or even some graduate courses by Patrick Miller called The Religion of Ancient Israel. It has a nice section on the divine council, but it again delves into priesthood and cult, again, the sacrificial system. He has discussions of what sacred space means, clean and unclean, all those sorts of things that you would associate with Israelite religion. So I recommend Miller's Religion of Ancient Israel very highly. Mark Smith, The Early History of God, Yahweh, and the Other Deities in Ancient Israel. Now, Smith is going to be writing from a critical perspective, meaning a non-evangelical stance. I don't want to suggest that evangelical scholars are not critical thinkers. That is not how the term is being used. But just so that you know where Smith is coming from, I like Smith's material. I have disagreements with it, as readers know, but this is a great survey for getting into divine council material, the whole, all the debates about whether the Israelites were originally polytheist or not, what's going on with El names for God like Yisrael and El Shaddai, El Olam, and then Yahweh. I mean, there's no El element. El, of course, is the primary name for the god of Canaan that we know from Ugarit, and the Hebrew Bible uses it as well. So what's going on with all that? It's really a good volume for getting you into the discussion as academics have it, whether they are evangelicals or not. Richard Hess, Israelite Religions, an Archaeological and Biblical Survey. Hess is an evangelical scholar, and he's a leading figure in Israelite religion in that area of study. This is a survey of basically all the issues and who holds what view, and it focuses on the archaeological material. Again, this is the kind of thing that you'd probably see required in a seminary course or a graduate course in Israelite religion, but I highly recommend it. Trygve Medinger, his book In Search of God, The Meaning and Message of the Everlasting Names. This is a good one-volume introduction to the names for God in the Old Testament and what their religious significance was in their original context. As far as the culture and life in ancient Israel, I think the best resource that I could recommend here, and it's amazingly detailed. It's sort of a no stone unturned approach on just literally every aspect of life in ancient Israel, whether you're a common person or you're royalty. it's really, in my mind, unsurpassed. It used to be a 2-volume set, but you can get it in one now. And that is Roland DeVoe's Ancient Israel, Its Life and Institutions. It's just excellent. I think if you get one book on culture and everyday life in ancient Israel, again, religious aspects, non-religious aspects, all the social strata, this is it. Marriage and family, even pastoral agricultural practice. They're just, it would be hard to find something that you'd really want to care about in terms of Israelite life that DeVoe doesn't cover. It's just excellent. Bruce Wells has a recent book called Everyday Law in Biblical Israel, an introduction. This is Wells' specialty, ancient Near Eastern law and Israelite biblical law. This is a sort of an introduction, an overview of that field. Different types of laws. Of course, you get into crime and punishment, that sort of thing. Wells's book is excellent. William Deaver has just come out with a book called The Lives of Ordinary People in Ancient Israel, When Archaeology and the Bible Intersect. In some ways, this would update the information in DeVoe, but by no means will it touch DeVoe. It will not surpass that. And again, my frank opinion is that DeVoe's is just it for this sort of thing. But if you're interested specifically in archaeology and you want it to be more current, I decided to add Deaver's book to the list. And lastly, Ebeling's book, Women's Lives in Biblical Times, I think is really worth considering having in your library and reading. Again, it's not going to surpass DeVoe. DeVoe will certainly touch on the life of women in ancient Israel, but again, it's current, it's up to date, and I wanted to make sure I added it to the list. Well, that's my list of the most highly recommended works for learning about the ancient Near Eastern context of the Bible, and specifically directing you to books where scholars have spent years in that material and have produced volumes or specific essays doing the work for you, telling you, showing you how the biblical material can be read and needs to be read through the lens of, through the context of, the world in which the biblical writers actually lived, the worldview that they were part of. And so I hope you'll take advantage of at least some of these resources. In the last episode of the podcast, I recommended the best books and reference works for understanding the religion and culture of the ancient Near East as it pertains to Old Testament study. Now, this episode wraps up my overall overview of taking the Bible's own context seriously through immersing yourself into the intellectual output of the era that the biblical writers actually lived in. This time, we're going to take a look at the books that deal with the literature and the context of the Second Temple period, in this case for New Testament study. Now, scholars who spent a lot of time in this material have produced a lot of fine stuff. A lot of great stuff, actually, for explaining how the Second Temple period worldview contributes to New Testament interpretation. And also in the process, they also get into how the Old Testament itself informs New Testament interpretation. Now, my goal in this episode is to direct you to some of the best reference works and monographs pertaining to the context of the Second Temple period, what that does for New Testament interpretation. And as before, you can find the resources that I'll mention here on the Naked Bible Podcast website. That's www.nakedbiblepodcast.com, and look under the Bibliography and Resources tab for links to all these works. Now, just like I did last time, I'm going to start with my most recommended materials. These are going to be reference works that any serious student of the Bible who cares about understanding, in this case, the New Testament in context, you will own these. If, again, you really want to pay attention to this, you really want to go beyond Bible reading to something that's genuinely Bible study, and then paying attention to the actual biblical context, not some other context when you do your Bible study. In the last podcast episode, we were introduced to something called the InterVarsity Press, the IVP Bible Dictionary series. They had several volumes related to the Old Testament. Well, they also have several volumes related to the New Testament. And these are highly recommended. I use them all the time. They're just wonderful resources. So the first one is edited by Joel Green, and it's called Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. It does a great job of situating the gospel material and all sorts of academic questions and issues about the Gospels in a Second Temple period context and an Old Testament context. Another one edited by Hawthorne is the Dictionary of Paul and His Letters. That's followed by the Dictionary of the Later New Testament and its developments. The editor for that is Lansma. And Craig Evans also edits a broader volume in this series called the Dictionary of New Testament Background. All of these are highly recommended. They're excellent. They have great discussions. They're coherent, they're informed, and also very good bibliography. Now, one more source here. Carol Vandertoorn, the editor of Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. We mentioned this one last time in the last episode for our Old Testament context, but you should realize that that book, that reference work, DDD as we know it, includes the New Testament. So it's the whole Bible, deities and demons in the Bible. And so you will find very specific article entries on, let's say, Paul's terminology for divine beings, like the elements. The Greek word is the stoicheia. You will find very specific entries with great bibliography and, again, contextualizing the discussion as it ought to be. Moving on from that, Amy Jill Levine is the editor of something new called the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Now, what this really is it's essentially a study Bible. It's a New Testament study Bible, but the editors and the writers of the notes in this study Bible are all Jewish, and they're Jewish scholars. So this will help you get an informed New Testament reading through Jewish eyes. Again, this is a recommended work. I know several people who have either gone through the whole thing or almost the whole thing by now and just love it. It's not going to be a scholarly work per se, but it will give you a broad overview of Jewish context for what you're reading in the New Testament. Lastly, in this category, the reference category, I'm going to include a book by Simmons called Peoples of the New Testament World, an illustrated guide. Now, if you listen to the last episode, there was a book called Peoples of the Old Testament World. This is sort of a counterpart. It's going to go through all the sort of the major groups or players in the New Testament, things like Roman soldiers and centurions or Pharisees and Sadducees, zealots, different groups that you encounter. The Samaritans, again, for example. And it has short descriptions of what's going on with that term, who these people are, again, with good bibliography, and again, pertinent commentary related to where these individuals show up in the New Testament and how you need some background information to understand their importance. Now let's go to monographs now, again, just single volume works on specific things related to studying the New Testament in context. And again, the context of the Old Testament and the context of the Second Temple period. Some general works on Second Temple context. Oscar Scarson has two books that I have listed here. One is called Jewish Believers in Jesus, the Early Centuries, and the other one is called In the Shadow of the Temple, Jewish Influences on Early Christianity. These are broad, sweeping works. They have lots of pages. They're very detailed. And they go through the New Testament, the major sections. Again, it goes through period by period as well. The literature, the ritual, the culture, pretty much anything you can think of, again, as it pertains to life in the first century, as you would encounter it as either a Jew or a Jewish believer in Jesus, someone living at the dawn of the early church. It's excellent. Both of them are excellent, and I recommend them. David Flusser has 2 volumes. Now, these are going to be written at a level, a more academic level. They're going to, they might be a little more dense than Scarson, and that again is by design. These 2 works would make good reference works. I don't know that you'd want to read them straight through, but you might. The first one is called Judaism of the Second Temple Period, Volume 1, Qumran and Apocalypticism. Again, you can tell by the title, it's fairly focused. Qumran, of course, is the location where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Apocalypticism is the belief that the end of the world was impending. And so there's a lot of that sort of material at Qumran and floating around in the Second Temple Period that informs parts of the New Testament. And the second volume is Judaism of the Second Temple Period, Volume 2, Sages and Literature. This would be essentially material that's not apocalyptic. So again, these are 2 good reference. I don't have them grouped in reference works because they're not edited volumes necessarily. They're shorter, but they're pretty dense, and so you could consider them as things to consult rather than just to read straight through. But you might want to do that. Craig Evans has a book called The World of Jesus and the Early Church, Identity and Interpretation in Early Communities of Faith. Again, the title gives you an idea of what's covered there. That will be more readable. It's shorter, it's more compact, and therefore it doesn't cover as much as the other volumes that I included. But really anything Craig Evans does is worth having. He's an excellent scholar, an enjoyable guy as well, with a broadly evangelical perspective. Next category would be interpretation of Scripture in New Testament times. Now, if you would flag one of these in this list as being really, really maybe the top of the list, top shelf importance, it would be this one. What this category means, interpretation of Scripture in New Testament times, is that the New Testament writers had methods of interpreting the Old Testament. And those methods were very much in the mainstream in concert with the way people in the Second Temple era were interpreting the Old Testament as well. So we can't be thinking a thought like the New Testament writers, just because we have this doctrine called inspiration, that the New Testament writers were somehow getting a new method from God for looking at the Old Testament, or we're coming up with something novel. Now, again, in many ways, you could say that there was a novel twist because Jesus was incarnated, and they're looking at things through the lens of Jesus. But what they're doing in terms of interpretive method with the Old Testament is completely mainstream for their culture. And I'm going to give you some books here that will help you understand that, help you frame that, and again inform your New Testament study. These works also focus on the fact that when the New Testament writers quote the Old Testament, they don't always use the same text. Paul might quote from the Hebrew in one place, he might quote from the Septuagint in another. In a third occasion, you might not be sure what he's quoting. Maybe he's influenced by an Aramaic translation, a Targum. There are all sorts of issues when it comes to the citation of the Old Testament. And it really matters, because one thing you learn pretty quickly is that the New Testament writers do not, and I repeat, do not just strike literal one-to-one equivalences between the Old and New Testament, or between the Old Testament and what they're saying about Jesus. They will do things with Old Testament passages that you'll look at and you'll wonder, how in the world are they ever getting that point? And it's going to be books like the ones I'll list here in a moment that help you understand what in the world they're doing, and how people in that day would have looked at what they were doing and said, oh, I get it. You're adopting this method, you're using that method. It wasn't foreign to them. So let's go through the volumes here. There's one by Watson that is really valuable for historical overview. It's called A History of Biblical Interpretation, Volume 1, The Ancient Period. It's a survey of various interpretive methods by different people, different groups, and how the New Testament writers, would be interacting with that or part of that. Beale has a book called Handbook on the New Testament Use of the Old Testament, Exegesis and Interpretation. If you're going to pick a book off this list, I would recommend Beale's book to sit down and just read the whole thing, because it's designed as an introduction to how the New Testament uses the Old and why that matters for biblical interpretation. 3 volumes by Moyse, Moyise, in case you're listening. He is a respected New Testament, Second Temple scholar that focuses on the use of the Old Testament in the New. And so I list his 3 volumes here. These really are, they're very academic. They're almost bibliographic essays. Who says what about what? What are the issues? All that sort of thing. So again, this is one of those that's almost a reference work, but yet isn't. Don't tackle these until you've read through Beale's book and gain some understanding through that book. But Moyse has 3 books: Jesus and Scripture, studying the New Testament use of the Old Testament; Paul and Scripture, again studying the New Testament use of the Old; and then thirdly, later New Testament writings and Scripture, the Old Testament in Acts, Hebrews, the general Catholic epistles, and the book of Revelation. So this is a very important category, and you want to have good material here and be exposed at least to Beale, and I would say also Watson, thoroughly, so you know what the issues are when you go to interpret the New Testament and you're reading commentaries and other material. You'll be able to understand what the concerns of the commentator are, really what he's talking about when it comes to hermeneutics and exegesis. Greco-Roman Hellenistic Context, I have 3 volumes here. Ferguson's book, Backgrounds of Early Christianity. Again, this favors Greco-Roman backgrounds rather than the Second Temple Jewish. But again, the Romans were the overlords here, so they're still in the Second Temple period. But because they controlled so much of the area and their influence was so broad, there is something to be said for Greco-Roman context as well. Ferguson's book has been a long-standing go-to resource for this kind of material, so I highly recommend that. Jeffers has a book called The Greco-Roman World of the New Testament Era, exploring the background of early Christianity. It would be more recent than Ferguson in several respects, but I can't say that it would supersede Ferguson, but if you're going to have 2 books, these would be the 2 best to have. Third is David De Silva's Honor, Patronage, Kinship, and Purity, Unlocking New Testament Culture. And I listed here because broadly it is about New Testament culture, Jewish and Roman. But I listed it here because it's not exclusively, again, Second Temple Jewish. You will get Greco-Roman material in here, but the nice thing about this book is it'll also relate it to a Jewish context here and there as well. You should also have something about the history of the Second Temple period itself. And so 3 titles here. Lester Grab's An Introduction to Second Temple Judaism, Schiffman's From Text to Tradition, A History of Second Temple and Rabbinic Judaism, and Saki's book, The History of the Second Temple Period. Now, of the 3, the 3rd volume is the most lengthy. It'd be the most academic, again, just in terms of reader level or reader expectation. But the others are going to be fine. This will give you a good overview of the history of the period, the groups, the sects, like Pharisees, Sadducees, and whatnot, and this formative period, because Rabbinic Judaism, what we think of as Rabbinic Judaism, which is actually post-New Testament, actually has its beginnings in the Second Temple period. So this will give you a good overview of all that. Let's talk about Dead Sea Scrolls a little bit. I've listed several books here specifically that relate to the Dead Sea Scrolls and their impact on Christianity or Christian ideas or Christian origins. So let's run through them. Peter Flint and James Vanderkam have a book called The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Their Significance for Understanding the Bible, Judaism, Jesus, and Christianity. So that one's broader, but it's a very good intro. Craig Evans, again, has a book, Christian Beginnings in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, it's all about how the scrolls inform our understanding of the genesis of the early church, the sort of the makeup of it, the Jewishness of it. Joseph Fitzmyer, The Dead Sea Scrolls and Christian Origins, again, accomplishes or works on the same tasks as Evans's book. A little more specialized here, John Collins, 2 volumes by him, Religion in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then a second volume called The Scepter and the Star, Messianism, or Messianism, might be bring out for those of you who are listening and don't see the term. This is about messiahship. Messianism in the Light of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the title, The Scepter and the Star. Messianism in the Light of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Both of these volumes deal with really sort of the theology of the people at Qumran associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the theology of Second Temple Judaism, and even more particularly what their views of Messiah were, what their messianic expectation was. Now, in that regard, the next title, also again by Craig Evans, is Eschatology. Again, that's the study of last things. Eschatology, Messianism, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, this focuses again on their messianic expectations and also their expectations about the time of the end, because the Qumran community, or at least certain portions of them, thought themselves to be living in the last days. And again, that's something you read in the New Testament as well. So these sorts of works inform us about the theology of serious Jews at the time, and also, again, very specific doctrinal issues related to New Testament studies, such as Christology or messianic expectations. Next category is Pseudepigrapha, Apocrypha, and the New Testament. I have 2 titles here. They're both aimed at sort of giving us a good look, a broad overview of how the Pseudepigrapha and the Apocrypha matters for New Testament interpretation. Charlesworth is the first one here. His book is called The Old Testament Pseudepigrapha and the New Testament. Again, you'll learn all about the conceptual overlaps there and how one informs the other. And then David De Silva, The Jewish Teachers of Jesus, James, and Jude, What Earliest Christianity Learned from the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. Now, this is a brand new title. I'm making this podcast in August of 2012. This book is not due out until October. For those of you who are listening who go to the Evangelical Theological Society meetings or the Society of Biblical Literature meetings, I'm sure this book will be there in time for the conference, but just for those of you who might be listening, want to be clicking on the links on the nakedbiblepodcast.com website for this book. It's not published just yet. Be a couple months. Lastly, I have a category called Contextualized New Testament Theology. Are there books that really sort of do theology, do New Testament theology, against the backdrop of the Second Temple period, and sort of flesh out what that looks like? Again, New Testament theology explained in light of a deep understanding of the Old Testament and how there's continuity between the Old and New Testaments, and also the Second Temple material. Well, there's actually a lot of that, but I've listed 3 titles here, and then a 4th that sort of goes with the first 3. These 3 titles are all by N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright's written a lot of books, but I recommend these 3 because they were designed as a trilogy, essentially to really cover the main points, main aspects of New Testament theology. The 3 titles are The New Testament and the People of God. That's volume 1 in a series called Christian Origins and the Question of God. Then his second book, Jesus and the Victory of God, that would be volume 2. And then thirdly, The Resurrection of the Son of God, volume 3. The material that Wright covers here is just densely permeated with Second Temple contextual material and appreciation and knowledge for that material, and real sensitivity to continuity between the Testaments. Very important. Both those things are very important, again, because that is the New Testament context. Now, Wright is not without controversy. Specifically, he is sort of understood or viewed as the main popularizer of something called the New Perspective on Paul. And briefly, that is a subject that has to do with what was Paul's view of the law, and specifically Paul's view of the works of the law. How was what Paul was saying about the gospel consistent with or an alteration of Jewish thinking about salvation? And Wright is controversial because he rejects the idea that most Jews thought that they could get to heaven by works. And so if you're going to say that, then the question becomes, well, what was Paul upset about? How was he defining the gospel as something new? Well, again, that's what the New Perspective is about. Now, toward explaining all that and having a good introduction to it that's even-handed, I recommend Yinger's book. It's a very small book. It's designed for lay people. I've read it, and I think it's excellent. It's called The New Perspective on Paul by Yinger. Again, you could probably knock that out in an hour or two, and it'll give you a very good overview of what the issues are related to that specific topic. So that's what I wanted to cover in this episode. The next time in the Naked Bible, we'll get into some things that might feel more traditionally like recommendations for Bible study. So we're leaving now the contextualization issue. I'm hoping, again, that you'll get some of these books so that you know what there is to think about, some of the questions that need to be asked, some of the landmines in interpretation, and just really feel driven to keep your study of the Bible in the context of the world in which the biblical writers lived, and no other context.